Okay, so Billi, the coalition announced this new nuclear energy policy last week. We're going to talk about it today. But I think for a lot of people, especially young people, the extent of our nuclear energy education starts and stops with Homer Simpson. He worked at a nuclear power plant alongside his trusty sidekick, a frosted donut.
There's a problem with the reactor. What do you do?
There's a problem with the reactor? We're all gonna die!
But there has to be more to this than Homer, and now it seems to have quite a prominent role in the climate change discussion. So first, can you just explain what exactly nuclear energy is?
I'll try my best to explain it better than Homer Simpson, but no promises. So nuclear energy is produced through this process of fission, where atoms, which are just tiny bits of matter, are heated and split into many different parts. And the process is normally fueled by uranium, which starts this chain reaction where heat is created before a cooling agent like water is used, and that produces steam. Now that steam then spins machines called turbines, which generate electricity. It all kind of sounds like a Year 10 science class, but basically what you need to know is it's the same kind of principle that goes into making the atomic bomb, but it's obviously used for very different purposes, and the main difference is the speed at which the energy is released. In a nuclear reactor, it is released slowly, and in a nuclear bomb, it is released really quickly, pretty much instantly.
Okay, so there's a big process that produces these tiny bits of matter that's heated up, split up, makes some steam, makes the wind turbines go round. That's kind of the Homer Simpson explanation for it. So is it considered renewable energy then?
No, it is not considered renewable energy. Like I said, this process is fueled by something called uranium, and Australia actually has one of the world's biggest uranium reserves, so we have lots of it. But it is a finite resource, so there is limited supply of it around the world, and the definition of renewable is energy that comes from a source that won't run out.
Right.
So for that reason, nuclear energy is not considered renewable. Also, although nuclear power doesn't produce greenhouse gases, it does produce radioactive waste.
Right, okay, so you've got something that isn't strictly a renewable, but it actually is banned in Australia, right?
Yeah, so like I mentioned in the intro, it has been banned in Australia since 1998. And this came after multiple disasters. Some were intentional and some were accidental during the 20th century. And that included Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombs in World War II. And then also there was the Chernobyl meltdown in Ukraine. A lot of people might recognize that from the very famous series that was created a few years ago. And that was the worst nuclear accident in history. About 30 people died at the time, but then also the radiation poisoning from that disaster is estimated to have caused thousands of deaths in the years since. And this obviously sparked large concerns worldwide, including in Australia, about nuclear power and radioactive waste.
I feel like another good reference point for everybody is Oppenheimer, the film that came out last year, which kind of covered that period of history.
Yes, exactly. And so in the late 1990s, Australia's federal government legislated a nationwide ban on building nuclear facilities. And this ban is actually quite rare. Australia is one of only just a few wealthy, developed countries that don't have nuclear power and that has a nationwide ban. Important to note though, we do have one operational nuclear site in South Sydney, but that is used for research and not to generate energy, as the coalition is now wanting Australia to do. One other thing to mention before we move on is that at the time of the national ban in 1998, it was pretty inconsequential because we didn't need it because we were so reliant on coal and gas at the time. But the reason why it's coming up now is because the country is trying to shift towards other ways of generating energy because, at a very basic level, coal and gas is not good for the environment and it's also a finite resource. So this is all part of Australia's plan of how to shift away from coal and gas.
And all of this came up in the political sphere when the coalition kind of spruiked the development of nuclear power as an alternative way for Australia to reach its obligations of net zero in 2050. This isn't the first time they've pitched nuclear though, right?
Not at all. The coalition has been spruiking the development of nuclear power as an alternative to gas and coal since it lost the 2022 federal election. So it's been about 2 years now that I've been hearing this from them. And they believe that nuclear technology is needed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So just to give you some context, both the coalition and the Labor Party, who are the two major parties in Australia, they have the same goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. But what they disagree on is how to get there.
Right. And what technology to use.
Exactly. So they disagree on a whole range of things in this area of how, but one of the key areas is nuclear. The Liberal Party believes that we need nuclear power to get there, and the Labor Party doesn't.
And so the coalition came out last week and gave us a bit more detail on how they would actually implement a nuclear policy.
Yeah, so last Wednesday, opposition leader Peter Dutton announced plans to build 7 nuclear reactors. And he plans to build these at existing power plants that are scheduled to close. So his plan is to convert existing infrastructure into nuclear power plants.
Right.
So think of like a closing coal mine, turning that into a nuclear energy plant. And he says that these sites are already equipped with cooling water and transmission lines needed for nuclear reactors.
So he's basically pitched us an energy version of the block, taking something old and turning it into a nuclear plant.
That's a very Sam comparison.
Yeah, Scott Cam's going to take us through the process. But on a serious note, why does the coalition say we actually need this?
At a very basic level, it's because they say that we are running out of energy.
Which is a pretty bipartisan approach.
Yeah, there's no disputing that we need a transition to occur. But the coalition claims that nuclear energy is the best way for this transition to occur, and they claim that nuclear energy would alleviate disruptions to energy supply as Australia makes this transition. The coalition also argues that if we get started now, Australia could benefit from nuclear energy for 80 years to come, and that it would provide more consistent electricity for the country. And that's the key word that they're using, consistent.
So let's say the coalition does win the next election, you said it sometime before May. What would the timeline be then on a nuclear program rolling out in Australia?
So Dutton says that the first sites would be operational between 2035 and 2037.
So relatively soon.
Yeah, in the next 10 to 15 years. But that's depending on whether smaller modular reactors or larger scale plants are deemed, quote, the best option. Now, this is really interesting that they are considering larger plants, because when the Daily Aus actually spoke to Dutton last year, he said that larger scale plants were completely out of the question.
I don't support the establishment of big nuclear facilities here at all. I'm opposed to it. But for the small modular reactors, we can have them essentially replacing brownfield sites now. So you can turn coal off.
Interesting, and it's quite a reversal. There's kind of, quite absolute language used in that statement. So that's an interesting clip. What would the cost of this be?
The coalition hasn't explained that part of its policy yet. Dutton says that we will know the costings, though, very soon. But what we do know is 2 things. The first is that nuclear is renowned for being extremely, extremely expensive. Last month, the National Science Agency, the CSIRO, found that, quote, nuclear is currently the most expensive type of electricity to generate. So they estimated that nuclear power would cost roughly twice as much as renewable energy and take at least 15 years to come online. Although the coalition, as I mentioned before, thinks that we could have nuclear power operational by 2035. So There is some disputing, but nevertheless, at least a decade we're talking. But the second thing is that in all of the press releases and press conferences from the coalition last week, they said that nuclear will deliver, quote, cheaper electricity costs for Australia. How those things two marry up, we don't yet know. My understanding is that nuclear power plants are very expensive to build, but are actually relatively cheap to run and operate.
So, Billi, you're a political thinker. You watch
Thank
Australian
you, Sam.
politics very carefully. We've just had a really interesting 2 weeks where both parties have said very strong things to each other about climate policy. Do you expect this to continue to be a major election topic?
I think so. And I think it's one of those rare topics that I don't actually fully know what young people think. And so I want to put in the show notes a poll to understand what does our audience think about nuclear energy. I'm really interested. I think when it comes to, climate change and cost of living, we have a really strong understanding of what the population thinks.
And we have an understanding that people are concerned by it. But this is now more a solutions-based proposition.
Exactly. And I think it'll be really fascinating to know what our audience thinks. I know that Peter Dutton has said that he's happy for this next election to be a referendum on nuclear energy.
Wow. Okay. So it's a big topic, and it's one that we're going to keep you on top of as listeners of TDA. Thank you so much for joining us on today's pod. I will throw a link to that question in today's show notes. Billi, thank you so much for taking us through that, and we'll speak to you again tomorrow morning.